The Monster King, Henry VIII's gruesome physical decline and his reign of psychological terror. The year was 1546, and the servants of Greenwich Palace drew lots with trembling hands, not for gold or favour, but to determine who would face the horror of dressing England's king. The chosen few would enter the royal chambers armed with perfumed cloths pressed against their faces, steeling themselves against the putrid stench that had become synonymous with absolute power. Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, now lay before them as a grotesque parody of royalty. His massive frame, swollen to nearly 400 pounds, dominated the specially reinforced bed like a mountain of diseased flesh. The king's legs, wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, oozed a constant stream of pus and rotting tissue that pooled beneath him in sickening puddles. The smell was so overwhelming that even hardened courtiers fled retching from his presence. This was no ordinary monarch in decline. This was the transformation of a man into something far more terrifying than any medieval demon conjured by fevered imaginations. The handsome athlete who had once dazzled Europe with his wit and vigor had become a walking nightmare, his body betraying him as spectacularly as he had betrayed those who trusted him. But Henry's physical deterioration was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper rot that had consumed his soul. As his flesh decayed, his mind twisted into something equally monstrous. The palace had become a labyrinth of terror where whispered words could mean death, where even his own children lived in fear of their father's paranoid rage, and where the king's diseased imagination conjured conspiracies in every shadow. The servants who drew the short straws that morning could never have imagined they were witnessing the final act of one of history's most chilling transformations, the complete metamorphosis of a Renaissance prince into a monster whose reign of psychological terror would haunt England long after his putrid corpse finally stopped breathing. Chapter 1. The flesh betrays the crown. The transformation began subtly, as all great horrors do. In 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich, Henry VIII's world changed forever when his horse crashed down upon him with bone-crushing force. For 2 hours, England held its breath as their king lay motionless, unconscious, teetering on the edge of death. When he finally awakened, those closest to him noticed something had fundamentally shifted behind his eyes. Modern medical experts believe this accident caused severe traumatic brain injury, triggering a cascade of physical and psychological changes that would define Henry's monstrous final decade. But the brain injury was only the beginning of his body's spectacular rebellion against its royal inhabitant. The weight gain came first, insidious and relentless. The athletic frame that had once cut an impressive figure in tournaments began to expand at an alarming rate. By 1540, Henry's waist measured an astounding 54 inches, larger than most people are tall. His neck had swollen so dramatically that specially designed doublets had to be constructed to accommodate his massive girth, while his legs struggled to support the ever-increasing bulk above them. But it was the ulcers that truly marked Henry's descent into physical horror. What began as small sores on his legs gradually evolved into gaping wounds that refused to heal. These weren't mere scratches or minor infections. They were massive, suppurating craters that burrowed deep into the flesh, exposing bone and sinew to the air. The constant drainage of pus and decaying tissue created a nauseating cocktail of odors that permeated every room Henry entered. Court physicians, those brave enough to examine the royal legs, described wounds that seemed to have a malevolent life of their own. The flesh around the ulcers had turned a sickly greyish green, while the drainage had taken on the consistency and colour of rotten milk. The pain was excruciating, causing Henry to roar and thrash like a wounded animal during dressing changes. By 1546, the king's physical condition had deteriorated so dramatically that he could no longer walk unassisted. A specially constructed chair with wheels and pulleys became his primary means of transportation, operated by a team of sweating servants who tried desperately to breathe through their mouths as they wheeled their putrid cargo through the palace corridors. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's physical decline was how it seemed to feed his growing megalomania. Rather than humbling him, his body's betrayal only intensified his demands for absolute submission from everyone around him. As if compensating for his physical weakness, Henry's psychological cruelty reached new depths of sadistic creativity, transforming the royal court into a theatre of fear where the king's rotting presence served as a constant reminder of mortality and the corruption of absolute power. Chapter 2. The Palace of Paranoia. As Henry's body decayed, his mind descended into a labyrinth of suspicion and terror that transformed the Tudor court into something resembling a medieval police state. The king, who had once been known for his charm and wit, now saw assassins in every shadow, poison in every meal, and treason in every whispered conversation. The royal bedchamber became the epicenter of this paranoid universe. Henry slept surrounded by loaded crossbows, their steel bolts gleaming in the candlelight like metallic sentinels. Multiple daggers lay hidden beneath his pillows and mattress, while armed guards stood motionless in the corners, their eyes never leaving the king's massive, wheezing form. Even sleep, that most basic human necessity, had become a military operation requiring constant vigilance. But Henry's paranoia extended far beyond his sleeping arrangements. He ordered the construction of a vast network of spy holes and secret passages throughout his palaces, creating a web of surveillance that would have impressed modern intelligence agencies. Courtiers never knew when they might be watched, their most private conversations potentially overheard by the king's army of informants. The dining rituals became particularly elaborate theaters of fear. Every morsel of food that approached Henry's lips was first tested by multiple tasters, each waiting exactly 30 minutes before the king would touch anything. But even this wasn't sufficient for Henry's fevered imagination. He demanded that his meals be prepared in completely sealed kitchens, with armed guards monitoring every step of the cooking process. Salt, spices, even the water used for cooking. Everything required individual testing by different servants. Henry's spy network grew into a monstrous organism that fed upon itself. He employed spies to watch his spies, creating layers of surveillance so complex that no one could be certain who was loyal to whom. Court life became a deadly game, where a misinterpreted glance or poorly chosen word could result in a trip to the Tower of London. The psychological toll on the court was devastating. Nobles who had once competed for the king's favor now lived in constant terror of attracting his attention. They developed elaborate rituals of submission and flattery, hoping to appease the increasingly unstable monarch while secretly praying they wouldn't be his next victim. Perhaps most chilling was Henry's treatment of his own family. He stationed spies to watch his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, convinced that his own children were plotting against him. These young women, barely more than teenagers, lived under constant surveillance, their every action scrutinized for signs of disloyalty by a father whose diseased mind could no longer distinguish between real threats and paranoid fantasies. The palace corridors, once filled with music and laughter, now echoed with whispered fears and hurried footsteps. Servants scurried through their duties with downcast eyes, knowing that even accidentally bumping into furniture could be interpreted as suspicious behavior by their increasingly unhinged master. Chapter 3. The Wives Who Paid in Blood. No aspect of Henry VIII's monstrous transformation was more horrifically displayed than in his treatment of the women who shared his bed and bore his name. What history often sanitizes as a quest for male heirs was, in reality, a sustained campaign of psychological torture that would have impressed the most creative serial killers of any era. Anne Boleyn's final weeks exemplified Henry's genius for cruelty. Rather than simply ordering her execution, Henry orchestrated an elaborate psychological campaign designed to break her spirit completely. He forced her to watch from her window as 5 men, including her own brother George, were led to their deaths for the fabricated crime of adultery with the Queen. Anne understood with crystal clarity that she was witnessing a preview of her own fate, choreographed by the man who had once promised to love her forever. The night before her execution, Henry sent Anne a mockingly courteous message asking if she had any final requests. When she asked to die by the sword rather than the axe, Henry graciously agreed, but only after making her wait in terror for an additional day while a professional executioner was summoned from France. Even in granting her final wish, Henry found a way to extend her psychological agony. Catherine Howard's ordeal revealed an even more sadistic dimension to Henry's character. When Henry discovered evidence of her premarital relationships, he didn't simply order her execution. Instead, he had Parliament pass a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their sexual history, essentially creating new legislation specifically to justify killing his teenage wife. But the legal machinations were merely the opening act. Henry subjected Catherine to weeks of interrogation designed to extract every intimate detail of her past relationships. The terrified girl was forced to recount her sexual experiences in explicit detail to a panel of male courtiers, her humiliation serving as entertainment for Henry's twisted sense of justice. Catherine of Aragon endured perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture of all Henry's wives. Rather than killing her outright, Henry chose to destroy her slowly through isolation and degradation. He stripped her of her title, forbade her from seeing their daughter Mary, and spread rumors that she was mentally unstable. Catherine spent her final years essentially under house arrest, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read, slowly dying of what many historians believe was poison administered by Henry's agents. Jane Seymour, often portrayed as the lucky wife who died naturally, experienced her own unique horror. She died from complications following childbirth, but Henry's reaction revealed the true depth of his callousness. Before Jane's body had even cooled, Henry was already planning his next marriage. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to begin negotiations for his 4th wife, treating Jane's death not as a personal loss, but as a minor inconvenience in his ongoing quest for additional heirs. The psychological games extended beyond the marriages themselves. Henry delighted in forcing his ex-wives to attend court functions where they would witness his happiness with his new queens. He required them to bow and show deference to their replacements, transforming public ceremonies into elaborate humiliation rituals. Perhaps most revealing was how Henry rewrote history to justify each marriage's end. He convinced himself that each wife had betrayed him in some fundamental way, transforming his own cruelty into righteous punishment for their imagined crimes. This psychological sleight of hand allowed him to escalate his brutality while maintaining his self-image as a wronged victim rather than a perpetrator of domestic terror. Chapter 4. The Grotesque Rituals of Consumption. Henry VIII's relationship with food transcended mere gluttony and entered the realm of the genuinely grotesque. His daily consumption rituals became elaborate performances that revealed the depth of his physical and psychological corruption, transforming the basic human need for nourishment into a nightmare spectacle that horrified even his hardened courtiers. The sheer volume of Henry's consumption defied comprehension. His daily intake approached 5,000 calories, more than double what an active adult male should consume. Yet Henry had long since ceased any meaningful physical activity. His kitchens operated around the clock, employing over 200 staff members whose sole purpose was feeding their increasingly monstrous master. But it wasn't merely the quantity that disturbed observers, it was the ritualistic nature of Henry's eating habits. Each meal began with an elaborate ceremony of food testing that could last up to an hour. Multiple servants would taste every dish, waiting exactly 30 minutes before Henry would touch anything. The king insisted on this delay, even for foods he'd eaten safely the day before, convinced that his enemies were constantly devising new poisoning strategies. Henry's meals were consumed in front of audiences of courtiers who were required to stand motionless and watch their king eat. These feeding sessions could last up to 4 hours, during which Henry would methodically work his way through enough food to feed a small village. The sound of his eating, the wet smacking, the labored breathing between swallows, the occasional grunt of satisfaction, filled the dining hall with a soundtrack that haunted his observers' dreams. The king's food beliefs bordered on the mystical. He convinced himself that consuming swan would make him more graceful, despite his inability to walk without assistance. Massive quantities of venison would supposedly improve his hunting prowess, though Henry hadn't successfully hunted anything in years. Oysters were consumed by the dozen in the belief they would enhance his sexual performance, a particularly tragic delusion given his wife's documented fears of his physical attention. As his condition worsened, Henry's eating habits became increasingly bizarre. He began demanding that certain foods be prepared in specific ways that had no basis in culinary tradition. Meats had to be cooked until they were nearly charcoal, supposedly to eliminate any possibility of poison, while vegetables were so overboiled they lost all nutritional value. The result was a diet that actively accelerated his physical decline while providing little actual nourishment. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's consumption rituals was how they reflected his broader relationship with power. Just as he consumed people, using them until they no longer served his purposes before discarding or destroying them, his approach to food became a metaphor for his insatiable appetite for control and domination. Servants reported that Henry often fell asleep immediately after eating. His massive bulk sprawled across specially reinforced chairs while partially chewed food fell from his slack mouth. The image of the once athletic king reduced to a drooling, unconscious mass of flesh became a powerful symbol of the corruption that had consumed not just his body, but the entire Tudor court. By his final years, even the act of eating had become a form of torture for those forced to witness it. The combination of his putrid body odor, the sounds of his labored consumption, and the knowledge that they were watching their king literally eat himself to death created an atmosphere of revulsion that permeated every meal. Chapter 5. The Final Descent into Madness and Death. The winter of 1546 brought with it a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into the very stones of Greenwich Palace. But nothing could compare to the chill that gripped the hearts of those who served England's dying king. Henry VIII's final weeks represented the ultimate convergence of his physical decay and psychological disintegration, creating a nightmare scenario that would haunt the memories of all who witnessed it. By January 1547, Henry's body had become so grotesquely swollen that he could no longer fit through standard doorways. His servants had to remove door frames to accommodate the specially designed wheeled chair that had become his throne and prison. The king's legs, now completely useless, dangled like rotting tree trunks, constantly dripping a mixture of pus and blood that left a trail of putrid moisture wherever he went. The smell had become legendary throughout the palace. Visitors claimed they could detect Henry's presence from 3 rooms away, while servants began requesting transfers to other royal households rather than endure the nauseating proximity to their king. The royal physicians, those brave enough to approach Henry's bedside, wrapped perfume cloths around their faces and tried to breathe only through their mouths during examinations. But it was Henry's mental state that proved most terrifying in those final weeks. His paranoia had evolved into full-blown psychosis, complete with hallucinations and delusions that transformed every interaction into a potential death sentence for his courtiers. He began seeing traitors in his own reflection and hearing conspirators' voices in the crackling of the fireplace. The man who had once been known for his sharp wit now spent hours arguing with invisible enemies or weeping inconsolably over imagined betrayals. The death scene itself was a masterpiece of Gothic horror. Henry's body had swollen to such proportions that his skin appeared translucent and stretched to the breaking point. His breathing came in ragged gasps that echoed through the chamber, like the dying wheeze of some massive bellows. The accumulation of fluids and gases in his decomposing tissue gave his skin an unnatural greenish tint, while his eyes had become so sunken they appeared as black holes in his bloated face. When death finally claimed Henry on January 28, 1547, even that final act became a source of terror for his attendants. His body had become so toxic that several servants who helped prepare it for burial fell ill within days, possibly from infection contracted through contact with his putrid remains. The corpse was so heavy and unwieldy that it required a dozen men to lift it into the lead-lined coffin that had been specially constructed to contain both his bulk and the anticipated gases from decomposition. But Henry's capacity for causing chaos extended even beyond the grave. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, the inevitable happened. The pressure from decomposition gases caused his coffin to explode. The lead lining split with a sound like thunder, spilling rotting royal remains across the interior of the funeral cart. The stench was so overwhelming that the entire procession had to halt while servants with cloths and buckets attempted to clean up the grotesque spillage. Local legends claim that dogs were seen licking Henry's remains from the road where they had spilled, providing a fitting end to a man who had consumed everything in his path, a king reduced to carrion for scavengers. Even in death, Henry VIII had managed one final act of revolting spectacle, ensuring that his grotesque legacy would be remembered not just for his cruelty, but for the literal corruption that had consumed him from within. The psychological impact on those who witnessed Henry's final transformation was profound and lasting. Many of his courtiers suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, unable to forget the image of their once magnificent king, reduced to a putrid mass of diseased flesh, or the sound of his final rattling breath as it escaped his rotting lungs. Conclusion: the monster's legacy. In the end, Henry VIII achieved a kind of immortality that he never intended. Not as the golden prince he once was, or even as the powerful monarch who broke with Rome, but as perhaps history's most complete example of how absolute power can transform a human being into something genuinely monstrous. His physical decay served as a perfect metaphor for the moral corruption that had consumed his soul, creating a legacy that continues to fascinate and horrify more than 4 centuries after his death. The man who claimed to rule by divine right had become living proof that no amount of power can protect someone from the consequences of their own corruption. His body's rebellion against his royal pretensions provided a kind of cosmic justice that his victims never lived to see, the ultimate demonstration that even kings are subject to the laws of decay and death. Perhaps most chilling of all is how Henry's transformation reveals the monster that lurks within unchecked authority. His descent from Renaissance prince to grotesque tyrant wasn't the result of external corruption, but rather the natural progression of absolute power, freed from any meaningful constraints. In Henry VIII's putrid final form, we see not an aberration of history, but a warning about the inevitable destination of unchecked human ambition, a lesson written in rotting flesh and psychological terror that remains as relevant today as it was 500 years ago.